Graphics card prices are slowly improving. Now, things still aren't great, but 3 months ago when we last looked at GPU cost per frame, we found that the vast majority of models weren't even in stock and available to purchase. Today, in most regions, you can actually buy the entire lineups from Nvidia and AMD, albeit not always at their MSRP. So it's time to revisit real-world graphics card prices and see how things are going after the launch of the GeForce RTX 5060 and Radeon RX 9060 XT. In this update, I'll be looking at pricing in 10 regions. Yep, that's right, 10 regions, the most countries we've examined in one of these videos. I've chosen the 10 countries that watch Hardware Unboxed videos the most and researched some suitable retailers in those countries. I've calculated the actual real-world cost per frame in all of those countries, and it's very interesting to see how competitive Nvidia and AMD are on a more global scale than just in the United States. I know a lot of you guys watching this video aren't in the US and are disappointed when the pricing where you live doesn't match the global MSRP, so this video is for you. But before we get into the data,
today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and the new Duranaut High Performance Thermal Paste. Duranaut offers extreme long-term stability combined with outstanding thermal conductivity, and this has been achieved through a specially engineered silicon oil combined with aluminium microparticles and zinc oxide nanoparticles of various shapes. Duranaut isn't electrically conductive and won't harden over time. For best performance, you'll want to apply a very thin layer, and to help with this, included is the TG Spatula Pro. The spatula's revised design allows for increased pressure during application, making it easy to spread a thin, even layer of Duranaut. So for more information, please check the link in the video description.
I'll kick this one off with a quick recap of the cost per frame using the current globally announced MSRP in US dollars. This is based off our latest gaming performance data at 1440p from the RX 9060 XT 16GB review. Unfortunately, we haven't put the 8GB model through this benchmark suite just yet, so it's not listed here, but we don't recommend it anyway for other reasons. At the MSRP, the Radeon RX 9060 XT and RX 9070 XT are pretty great value compared to other options on the market. The 9060 XT should be 17% cheaper per frame than the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB thanks to an $80 lower MSRP, and the RX 9070 XT should be 16% cheaper per frame than the RTX 5070 Ti. Both of these sneak under our threshold for Radeon value in 2025. Considering the increased ray tracing performance of RDNA 4 along with the introduction of FSR 4, we believe Radeon cards should be around 15% cheaper per frame than GeForce cards to get our recommendation. At the MSRP, in both of these crucial battles, AMD are meeting that criteria. We can also see that the 9060 XT 16GB should offer around 8% better value than the RTX 5060 in terms of raw performance, while also offering double the VRAM. So that's a pretty good deal now that 8GB is insufficient for gaming in 2025. The RTX 5080 and 5090 aren't especially good value as they have no real competition, but the 5080 should be no more than 18% more expensive per frame than a 5070 Ti. Lastly, we also have the Intel Arc B580 and B570 in these charts, which sit at the top, offering the best cost per frame at the MSRP. However, the value the B580 offers isn't amazing compared to the 9060 XT, granted the Radeon model is quite a bit more expensive. Currently, you're getting just a 6% cost per frame discount to choose Arc, and that's at the $250 MSRP, which is a little hard to justify given AMD's broader game compatibility. This comparison is a bit more favourable when looking at the B580 compared to the RTX 5060, 13% cheaper per frame, and a much better 12GB of VRAM compared to 8GB. Now let's flick over to some real-world prices, and we're starting with Newegg in the United States, looking at pricing for in-stock and available models sold through Newegg. You can currently get every current generation model on Newegg, but pricing is far from ideal, especially in the battle between the RTX 5070 Ti and RX 9070 XT. The GeForce model is currently selling for nearly $100 above MSRP, and the 9070 XT sits a staggering $200 above MSRP. This reduces the cost per frame margin from what should be 16% in favor of AMD to just 1%, making the GeForce model the obvious choice. The 9060 XT 16GB fares more favorably. currently sitting $40 above MSRP just a week after launch, which is pretty good considering how recently the card was released. The RTX 5060 Ti 16GB is also sitting $40 above MSRP, so the margin between each model is preserved and you're getting a 16% discount per frame on the Radeon model, so that's a sensible choice right now. There's a couple of other interesting tidbits here and there in the Newegg data. The B580 is still not available at $250 US, which destroys its value proposition. You just wouldn't consider it at $300 US. And the Radeon RX 9070 ends up being significantly better value than the 9070 XT, offering 18% cheaper cost per frame. This keeps it at the same price as the RTX 5070, and yeah, both are $50 above the MSRP, but the Radeon card is still the same 5% cheaper per frame as it should be based on MSRP pricing. Normally we would recommend the 9070 XT over either of these models, but the 9070 XT is just too expensive, which puts the RTX 5070 back into the conversation. I've also captured the data from Micro Center in the US because a lot of people claim they offer better prices if you live near a physical location. My threshold for physical retailers is the card must be available at a given price in at least 5 stores to be seen in this sort of chart. Compared to Newegg, there aren't a heap of changes. The RX 9070 becomes more expensive and worse value compared to the RTX 5070, and the RX 9070 XT becomes a little more competitive against the RTX 5070 Ti. However, the 9070 XT is still just 5% cheaper per frame than the GeForce model when it should be 16% cheaper, making the 5070 Ti the better buy at both Newegg and Micro Center in the US right now. The 9070 XT needs to be more like $650 to be competitive. In better news though, the RX 9060 XT 16GB is actually available at Micro Center a week after launch at its $350 MSRP, and that was at 16 physical locations at the time of capturing this data earlier this week. This makes it even more competitive against the $480 5060 Ti 8GB. It's 26% cheaper per frame and clearly the better buy in this mid-range to mainstream tier. Next up, we've got Scan in the United Kingdom, one of the largest retailers over there. Like at Newegg, the 9060 XT and 5060 Ti 16GB maintain their margin in cost per frame looking at real prices, with the Radeon model 18% cheaper per frame, so a pretty great deal. The UK MSRP for these models is £315 and £400 respectively, so pricing is looking normal. For mid-range shoppers, the RTX 5070 is clearly the best deal, offering about 10% better value than the RX 9070. That's a 15 percentage point swing compared to what should be the case at MSRP. The 9070 should actually be about 5% better value. That's because the 5070 is selling in the UK for £30 below the MSRP already, while the 9070 is above MSRP. Then in the higher parts of the range, the 9070 XT is still struggling to hit an appropriate price point. At £650, we're looking at an £80 increase over MSRP, while the RTX 5070 Ti is at its MSRP. That reduces the cost per frame discount going Radeon from 16% to just 7%, making the GeForce model the better buy. However, some work needs to be done to get the RTX 5080 back to a more appropriate level, as currently they are selling for a 31% cost per frame premium over the 5070 Ti, which is higher than originally advertised. In Australia at PC Case Gear, we generally have more favourable Radeon pricing than other regions, with a heavy Nvidia tax locally. For example, you can see the RX 9060 XT 16GB is the best value currently available graphics card, offering a 20% cost per frame discount compared to the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, and this is with both cards effectively at the local MSRP. If you have about $600 Australian to spend, there's no better choice than the latest Radeon model. The RX 9070 XT also has better pricing relative to the RTX 5070 Ti than in many other regions, but it's still not hugely competitive, and really this flagship Radeon card should be cheaper. At current pricing, we're looking at 12% cheaper cost per frame from Team Red, better than the US and UK, but still not quite enough to get a strong recommendation over the 5070 Ti, which is now sitting very close to the local MSRP. Both of these models are in the lower parts of the chart, so they're among the worst options you can get. For mid-range shoppers, things are pretty much as expected. Both the RTX 5070 and RX 9070 are the same price, so we see MSRP level cost per frame differences. Again, what should be happening here is the 9070 XT should only be a small amount more expensive and the obvious choice, but today the RTX 5070 is what you'd pick if you had around $1,000 to spend. The RTX 5090 is absolutely atrocious value in Australia, with one of the highest premiums of any region. Next up, we have Mindfactory in Germany. Here, the RX 9060 XT 16GB is offering 14% cheaper cost per frame than the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, so that's pretty close to where those cards should sit at MSRP. At an €80 premium over the RTX 5060, it's what I'd choose for mainstream gamers given it's faster and has a more suitable level of VRAM for current generation gaming. €80 isn't nothing, but it's a far better investment. RX 9070 XT pricing continues to be problematic up against the RTX 5070 Ti, with the Radeon card offering just 9% cheaper cost per frame. The German 5070 Ti launch MSRP was €880, but you can currently get one for €830, so 6% cheaper than MSRP. With that said, even at this lower than MSRP price, it's still more expensive than the US MSRP at around $800 US after removing Germany's 19% VAT and converting it to US dollars. The 9070 XT at €725 is around €100 above MSRP, a higher amount of inflation than the 5070 Ti, hence the current value situation. In the mid-range, we also see a similar situation to the UK, where the RX 9070 is more expensive than it should be, whereas the RTX 5070 is pretty much bang on MSRP. This creates a situation where instead of the Radeon card offering lower cost per frame, the GeForce card does. So in Germany, it makes sense to purchase the 5070 if you're after a card in this price range. We're off to Canada now to take a look at the online prices at Canada Computers. So these are the prices they will sell and ship you a card. Not every model is available online, but this is one of the few examples where the RX 9070 XT is substantially cheaper than the RTX 5070 Ti, offering 24% lower cost per frame, significantly better value than even MSRP pricing. The RX 9060 XT is also 20% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti 16GB, retaining its strong value proposition we also see in other regions. Canada Computers also have physical retail outlets, and if you happen to live near one, you'll often find a broader range of models at better prices. This helps the RTX 5070 Ti significantly, as the cheapest price drops from $1,300 Canadian online to just $1,090 in store. Meanwhile, the 9070 XT is the same price online and in store, so the value in store is more in Team Green's favour in this situation. Around that mid-range sort of price point, the RTX 5070 is in the lead. At MSRP, it should be the same price as the 9070, but in Canada, the 9070 is $100 more expensive, and so worse value than even the 9070 XT. Given the 9070 XT is 20% more expensive than the 5070 in terms of raw dollars, when it should be just 9% more going off the MSRP, it's hard to justify the 9070 XT as a 5070 alternative in Canada. Next, we head over to India to take a look at one of their local online retailers, Prime ABGB, in Indian rupees. Our Indian viewers have often reported to us that GeForce pricing over there is really bad, and that certainly seems to be the case. Look how bad the RTX 5090 is in terms of value. The RTX 5070 Ti seems to be more expensive there than it currently is in the US, and that's even considering local sales tax. This puts Radeon in a better position than we see in a lot of other countries. The RX 9070 XT is one of the better models in terms of cost per frame, coming in 15% cheaper than the 5070 Ti, which is what should be the case and makes the Radeon card the better buy in India. The RX 9060 XT 16GB is also great value at a 20% cost per frame discount compared to the 5060 Ti 16GB. The only one of the main battles that is more in favour of GeForce is the RTX 5070 versus the RX 9070 series. The 9070 non-XT should be the same price as the 5070, but is more expensive for the cheapest in-stock models, so it's hard to recommend. The 9070 XT is offering reasonable direct competition to the 5070, but is still a bit too expensive. On MSRP, it should be 5% cheaper per frame, but in India, it's a dead heat. The Philippines is one of the outliers when comparing the RTX 5060 Ti and RX 9060 XT, at least at local retailer DynaQuest PC, when viewing prices in Philippine pesos. The 9060 XT 16GB is just 10% cheaper per frame, when it should be 17% cheaper at MSRP, and that swings things back in favour of the RTX 5060 Ti, given its stronger feature set and more widespread DLSS 4 and 3 support. The RTX 5070 Ti versus RX 9070 XT battle is pretty similar to other countries, with the Radeon model offering 10% lower cost per frame, so nothing especially amazing there, and it appears price inflation is an issue for locals. The 9070 XT in pesos is the equivalent of $770 after removing sales tax, and the 5070 Ti is nearly $900. Ouch. Especially compared to Germany as an example, where both cards are nearly $100 US cheaper. The RTX 5070 is one of the more reasonable cards in terms of value and should be the go-to option for mid-range buyers, especially because the RX 9070 is hard to come by, at least at this specific retailer. But the pricing of the 9070 XT means it isn't offering strong competition, as it's 26% more expensive than the 5070 in raw pesos. Brazil is next up, and I'm looking at local retailer KaBuM with pricing in Brazilian reais. I'm pretty sure the name of this retailer is KaBuM, like an explosion, but also maybe it's KaBuM, which is certainly a funnier way of saying it. Anyway, Brazil is interesting in that the best value current graphics card there, at least at this retailer, is the RTX 5070, which offers 5% lower cost per frame than the 9060 XT 16GB. Based on the MSRP in US dollars, the 9060 XT 16GB should actually be offering 12% lower cost per frame, so that's a significant swing towards Team Green, and it seems to be caused by a lack of 9060 XTs in stock. Most models I saw were only available to pre-order, the cheapest of those being 3,040 reais. If that was the in-stock price instead of 3,500 reais, the 9060 XT 16GB would be the best value GPU in Brazil. I can see why the 9060 XT 16GB is so popular, because locally, even the cheapest model up for pre-order is the equivalent of $550 US, and RTX 5070s are going for over $800, such is the very high level of sales and import tax that our Brazilian friends have to deal with. For those that do have the money to spend on higher tier cards, the 9070 XT is offering 11% cheaper cost per frame than the 5070 Ti, which is similar to most other regions right now, making the GeForce model somewhat better value. I say that knowing full well that a 5070 Ti locally is basically the same price as a 5080 elsewhere. In the battle between the RTX 5070 and the RX 9070, Brazil is the worst region of the 10 I'm looking at for 9070 value. The RTX 5070 is clearly ahead in the mid-range. Polish retailer Morele is next up, and the currency we're looking at here is Polish złoty. Interestingly, this is one of the only regions I saw where the Intel Arc B580 actually sat at the top of the cost per frame chart, matching its position at MSRP. Now, compared to an RTX 5060, it's only offering a 10% discount in cost per frame, which is slightly worse than it should be at MSRP. But in most other regions, you either can't find the B580 at all, or it's priced at a similar level of value as current Radeon and GeForce models. In Poland, the RX 9060 XT 16GB is not especially good value, achieving just 5% lower cost per frame than the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, in which case you should just purchase the GeForce model. This is because the 9060 XT is currently selling for the equivalent of $415 US after removing sales tax, whereas the 5060 Ti is at $440. In other words, the Radeon card is well above its MSRP, something we aren't seeing in many other regions, whereas the GeForce model is right where it should be. The battle between the RX 9070 XT and 5070 Ti is very similar to most other regions. The 9070 XT is 12% cheaper per frame and still needs to come down in price generally. The RTX 5070 is also looking like a decent deal for mid-range buyers, with cost per frame that sits towards the top of the chart and actually beats the 9060 XT 16GB. With the RX 9070 being more expensive than the 5070 and the 9070 XT costing 20% more, there are definitely situations where it makes more sense to grab the 5070 around the 2500 to 2700 złoty range. Lastly, we have the Netherlands, and I'm looking at one of their local retailers, Megekko, in euros. This is another region where the price of the RX 9060 XT 16GB is a little underwhelming, sitting at just higher than MSRP, while the 5060 Ti 16GB is readily available for the equivalent of $430 US. This drops the cost per frame discount going Radeon from 17% at MSRP to just 11% in the Netherlands. However, the RX 9070 XT is positioned a bit better than other countries, offering a 14% cost per frame discount over the RTX 5070 Ti. So this is a country where it would make sense to opt for that €160 cheaper Radeon model. With that said, in both situations, you're still paying a premium over the global MSRP. The RTX 5070 is again quite decent in the Netherlands, especially considering it's nearly €100 cheaper than the RX 9070 and is effectively available at the MSRP. For mid-range shoppers, this puts the Radeon models out of reach from a value perspective, and you'd only consider something like the RX 9070 XT if you wanted a tier higher in performance along with extra VRAM. So in assessing pricing and cost per frame value across 10 regions, I found some pretty interesting trends and general observations about the market. In most regions, AMD has done a much better job of supplying the RX 9060 XT 16GB at its MSRP than they managed for the 9070 XT, with lots of MSRP stock available a week after launch. This keeps the Radeon model very competitive against the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, which is also widely available at or near the MSRP. In 7 out of 10 major regions, we would comfortably recommend the 9060 XT 16GB to mainstream gamers, and the average cost per frame discount for Team Red is sitting at a healthy 15%. The 9070 XT versus 5070 Ti battle is much closer. Both models are typically too expensive compared to the MSRP, but AMD, along with their partners, have struggled more than Nvidia when it comes to supplying cheaper models. The 5070 Ti is typically closer to its global MSRP than the 9070 XT, and while in some regions like Europe the 5070 Ti's local MSRP is bad, it can actually be found at or below that listed price. What this means is on average the 9070 XT is offering just 10% cheaper cost per frame than the 5070 Ti, when it should be offering a 16% discount based on the MSRP. There's just a couple of regions where the 9070 XT is available at an appropriate discount over the GeForce model. Most of the time, the RTX 5070 Ti is the better purchase right now. 9070 XTs being too expensive has had a flow-on effect for the rest of the mid-range. At MSRP, the 9070 XT is usually the card to get over both the RTX 5070 Ti and RTX 5070. It's just 9% more than the 5070 while offering better performance, better cost per frame, and more VRAM at the MSRP. In most regions though, you'll have to pay 20% more, not 9% more, to get the 9070 XT over the 5070, and this flips the value equation, so now the RTX 5070 has superior cost per frame. The 5070 is widely available at the MSRP, the 9070 XT is not, and this has had the effect of shifting the 9070 XT up into a higher tier when it really should still be in the same tier as the 5070. The RX 9070 isn't picking up that slack either in most regions. It should offer 5% cheaper cost per frame than the 5070 based on its MSRP, and that is currently the case in the US and Australia, but elsewhere, the RTX 5070 is superior value, flipping that equation in favor of GeForce. So the end result is that in nearly all regions, if you're after a mid-range graphics card, the RTX 5070 stands out as the best option with the lowest cost per frame. Intel Arc is in no man's land at the moment. At half of the retailers we looked at, you can't even buy an Arc B580, and when they are available, the cost per frame discount on offer compared to Radeon and GeForce is worse than it should be. The B580 is rarely a super poor deal, and in some regions like Poland, it has a clear, though small, lead in cost per frame, but it's just not that compelling in general. I think Intel missed their window. They really needed to get the B580 to be widely available at $250 US at the start of the year. 6 months later, there is much more competition. You will have also seen a range of older models throughout these cost per frame charts whenever we found they were still available. Across the board, there were really no situations where a last generation model was compelling. At best, last gen models offer similar value to current gen models, in which case you may as well purchase the current gen model. As an example, RTX 4060s haven't suddenly become much cheaper and therefore better options after the launch of the RTX 5060, even though 4060s are still quite widely available. So aside from steep discounts, I just ignore anything last gen. So that pretty much does it for our middle of the year graphics card cost per frame value update. I think expanding this to cover a lot more countries than we would usually cover in a cost per frame update has really helped have a look at how GeForce and Radeon compares across a broader range of the world, because often that US MSRP or even just the US pricing in general isn't really reflective of what we see in other regions. And there are certainly cases where GeForce is much more competitive than Radeon. There are some cases where the opposite is true as well. So yeah, top 10 countries from Hardware Unboxed. This is your cost per frame update for you guys, so hopefully you have appreciated it. If you want to support the channel and all the independent testing and analysis that we do, we have our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you'll get access to some pretty cool benefits. We've got our Discord community, great place to chat about tech. We've also got monthly live streams. We've got BTS content. Steve just posted a BTS video going through some of his latest studio updates, his gym updates. That's all right there for Patreon members to view. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.